its president, and we're delighted to have back with us some of the senior research folks at the OECD, specifically Dan Andrews and Giuseppe Nicoletti, for a presentation of some of their exciting new work, Confronting the Zombies, Policies for Productivity Revival. We have available their new policy paper, and it's also available, of course, on our website as well as the OECD website. We've had the good fortune to have presentations by the OECD on a number of previous occasions here, the OECD economics team, and they're always fascinating. I and my colleagues at PIE give a lot of credit to our friends at the OECD because they not only do good and relevant research, they do the laborious work of creating the data and cleaning the data and figuring out how to think about the data. And so we've all benefited a lot from previous work that Giuseppe and Dan and their colleagues have done looking at the micro foundations of macro phenomena. And in fact, Dan spoke here, I think a year and a half ago, roughly, with Catherine Mann, the then chief economist of the OECD, on this productivity work stream that he is overseeing. And there's a lot of good work there. Today's study, or rather the study being presented today, I think is fundamentally important, particularly as someone who spent a lot of time working on Japan, but which is now quite relevant for both the US and China. The idea that in an environment of loose financial conditions and constrained desire by politicians to see through bankruptcies, you have what are called zombie firms running around and continuing to potentially drag down productivity growth throughout the economy. And obviously in a period in which we have a slowdown, significant slowdown across the advanced economies, as well as some of the North Asian economies in productivity growth, it's important to look at these micro factors. But since I was working on Japan in those days through today, there's always been a lot of cheap talk about zombie firms, but very little actual empirical action. And so again, my credit to Dan, to Giuseppe, and to their colleagues at the OECD Structural Policy Analysis Division for taking up that challenge. The argument that they're going to make concerns the diversion of scarce resources from more productive firms. And in particular, it builds on, as I read it, their past work about the limited diffusion of frontier technologies throughout the economy as being one of the sources of the productivity slowdown, that zombie firms get in the way of that. And they, interestingly, in the tradition of OECD studies, talk about comparative public policies across countries, including such issues as insolvency regimes and taxation that deal with both worker displacement, but also more tellingly, specifically on the issue of firm closure. So this is a very exciting, important program. We are doing a lot of work here at the Peterson Institute on productivity, and we are delighted to have colleagues from elsewhere contribute to that ongoing discussion. Just to give you quick identification, Giuseppe Nicoletti will be speaking first, has been heading the OECD's Structural Policy Analysis Division since 2004, where he oversees exactly this kind of cross-country structural studies. He's been with the OECD since 1986 in a variety of roles, and prior to that, or rather was on leave as a senior economist at the Italian Antitrust Authority in the mid-90s. So I have a feeling he has some personal experience with zombie firms as well. We are then followed by Dan Andrews, who's been with the OECD since 2009. Prior to joining the OECD, he had worked at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and he is, as previously mentioned, leading the economic department of the OECD's productivity work stream. So thank you very much for coming and speaking today. Giuseppe, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, first of all, to the Peterson Institute and especially Adam for having invited us to, giving us the opportunity to present this work that deals with one factor that is kind of underplayed in the current debate about the productivity slowdown, which is the role that exit policies and the failure of these policies in some cases can have for productivity, for aggregate productivity. I don't need to remind you, or explain why productivity slowdown is a phenomenon that can have enormous negative consequences on our well-being and the sustainability of our, of our public policies and especially the social welfare systems in the future. I mean, there was a recent workshop organized here at the Peterson Institute dealing precisely with that. The starting point for our study is that there is mounting evidence that one factor behind this slowdown is an increasing misallocation of resources in our economies. Misallocation of resources across firms, both labor and capital. And this leads to a rising dispersion of productivity levels and productivity growth rates across firms. And one element of this phenomenon is that has been highlighted is the fattening of the left tail of the cross-firm productivity distribution. And one way to interpret this is that laggard firms have increasing difficulties in catching up to the frontier, to the best productivity performers. And our study focuses on the extreme pathology of this, let's call it laggards disease, which is the survival, the increasing survival of firms that in normal competitive conditions would be expected either to exit the market or be restructured. So what the study does in extreme synthesis is that first it tries to describe the incidence of this virus, of this extreme pathology, and then how it can have contagion effects on the rest of the economy as well, on healthy firms. And then second, it looks at the potential causes and remedies, of course, focusing on the policy element, which is most important for the OECD. So I will just go very briefly, be very brief here, also apologizing for having been late. We were in the house, but we didn't, see the time going by. And so I will be very brief, just to give some background and motivation to the work that Dan will describe in detail a little bit later. Dan is the main author of this study, together with his team. I was just supervising the study as well as a number of other studies in other areas as well. This is something that is very dear to me because I've been dealing with productivity for a long time. So I am very pleased to be able to, to introduce Dan's work. I invite interested people to look at the website where they can find all the details and all the number of papers that have been produced to support conclusions that that Dan and I will illustrate. So let me first remind the stylized facts that motivate our concern for productivity, for the behavioral productivity over the past couple of decades, and also why they may have to do with exit policies. We can start with looking at this figure, which is comes straight out of the Economic Outlook database, and as you can see, I mean, this is the evolution of potential per capita output growth on average in the OECD since the mid-90s, and as you can see, this chart shows that there was a significant decline in potential output growth, and the main reasons, the main drivers of this decline were first a deceleration of the growth in TFP, which is this blue bar, before the crisis, and then followed up by a strong deceleration of investment in the period after the crisis, during and after the crisis. Clearly, a revival of these two elements of labor productivity is crucial to be able to recover growth rates of potential output that were experienced before the crisis and even during the 90s. Now, focusing on TFP is particularly interesting because we know that TFP in the long run will be the main driver of growth. Also, we see a very significant drop in investment. We also know that this is tangible investment, but we know that intangible investment has been behaving a bit differently. So it's not clear that this is really measuring well what happened to investment. And also we know that there are strong spillovers from investment, especially intangible investment, on MFP, on multi-factor productivity. And so one question is, are these spillovers getting weaker, and why? So much of the focus will be on total factor productivity. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, recent research has focused very much on macro linkages. So to understand what goes on at the aggregate level, at the level of aggregate productivity growth, we need to look back beyond averages, look at the firm level data. And when you do that, which is the only way to really understand what drives aggregate outcomes, then you find, there's some kind of consensus around these three conclusions. You see within very fine sectors, very narrow sectors, a rising productivity dispersion, rising dispersion of productivity levels, but also growth rates. You see also a declining efficiency of reallocation of labor and capital. Depending on the country, the evidence is based on capital or labor. For instance, in the US, there are recent papers by L.T. Wang and co-authors showing this. And then also you see there's alarm for a declining business dynamism, especially there is evidence that startup rates have been declining, and more recently evidence that, as I was saying in the beginning, the left tail of the distribution has been fattening. These stylized facts are observed in the US, but also elsewhere, and of course they are interrelated. Because of course less dynamism generates and less efficient allocation generates the productivity dispersion. One way to see this is looking at this figure that Olivier has already seen, and maybe some of you have seen in the past because it was presented a few years ago here by Dan, which shows the increasing gap between the productivity growth at the frontier and productivity growth of the rest of the firm. I won't go into the details on how we define the frontier and the rest of the firms, but maybe I can answer questions later on. But so this increasing gap is one way to interpret this is that there is an increasing, rising difficulty of laggard firms, so firms that have weaker productivity to catch up to the frontier, and especially in the service sectors. It's mostly a story about the bottom. It's not so much that the frontier has been rising more rapidly than in the past. But what's interesting is that we see that the frontier keeps rising. We call this, we can call this, as I said, a laggard disease. And of course, this disease at the aggregate levels is an increasing burden on productivity. Now, if we now look at the pathology, extreme pathology of this disease, which is the rising survival of firms that should be exiting the market, which we define as those firms that are old and have a persisting tendency of not being able to cover interest on their debt. So the so-called zombie firms. So if we, for instance, it's difficult to compare levels, incidence of zombie firms across countries because especially with firm level data, often you have different coverage of data across countries, and even if you focus only on listed firms where the coverage is more similar, but still there are different propensity to list in different countries and so on. So but you know, instead of focusing on the incidence, on the shares, you can focus on the evolution of the shares. And if you look at the evolution of the share, then you see this interesting phenomenon that there are quite a significant differences across countries in both the degree and the persistence of the zombie firm phenomenon in different countries. For instance, you see that in Europe, you tend to have an increase a very significant increase in the share of zombies, and very persistent. Everywhere else, you have an increase, of course, over the crisis, as you would expect, but then you go back to normal. So the interesting thing about these differences is that they suggest that you know, institutions may have a role to play here, because this is, you know, institutions are what differentiates different countries, and you know, the business environment in different countries, and the regulations that and structural factors that affect the business environment may have a role to play. Especially, what is interesting is that what we do in our study, which Dan will illustrate more in detail, is that we come up with a new indicator of insolvency regimes. So we collect data through a questionnaire, an indicator that you know is kind of complementing the outcome-based indicators of the doing business, you know, World Bank doing business indicators. And you know, what you see is that the three countries for which we estimate that insolvency regimes are closer to best practice are the ones in which the zombie phenomenon is less serious. And also, if you then think about you know, the broader environment, what the financial system, then you know, these three countries are also the ones that have been able to you know, to solve more effectively the you know, banking problems over the past you know, from the outset of the crisis until now. While in Europe, we're still struggling with a lot of issues there. So, you know, insolvency regimes and banking health, as you will see, are two elements that come up in our study. So just let me finish with that, and you know, hand over the floor to Dan. Just you know, reminding for the benefit of the audience, the three main what we think are the three main contributions of the OECD in this area. So the first one is that we find that there is much scope to revive productivity growth by promoting easier exit or restructuring of firms. And we base this on new indicators, new data that we collect on insolvency regimes. And then we also find that there is a lot of complementarity across policy areas in this, you know, in driving outcomes for aggregate productivity. And finally, that's, you know, of course, you know, reforming insolvency regimes may have, you know, consequences that in terms of social cost, because it increases churning of jobs and firms, but this can be contained by labor market policy. So let me hand over the floor to Dan, that will go over these things more in details.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam, for inviting us here again today. It's a great forum, and we've been really looking forward to this. Just to follow on from what Giuseppe's been saying, So, in a sense, one of the first things we do in this project is to gather evidence for or against the conjecture that the increasing survival of weak firms is constraining aggregate productivity growth. And the main way we do this is we marshal cross-country firm-level data, and we try to identify, for instance, a group of firms that should exit in a competitive market, but they don't. So the baseline measure here is the extent to which firms older than 10 years can survive without covering their interest payments with their profits for 3 consecutive years. Now, I should make the point that this whole analysis is robust to using different measures. We can change the age definition, we can change the time window for the interest coverage, it doesn't matter. And one of the key phenomena we see here is not only has the share of zombie firms in the economy increased, which is shown by the blue line. But more importantly, the productive resources that are trapped in these firms has increased over time. So for instance, in Italy, you see that the white diamond shows that before the financial crisis in 2007, roughly 7% of the Italian business capital stock was sunk in these zombie firms. Now, that figure had risen to about 19% by 2013. And one of the things we do in the study then is to try dig deeper and assess the aggregate consequences of this. So the increasing survival of zombie firms can be bad for aggregate productivity growth through a number of channels. First is they just drag down the average unweighted productivity in the economy. Secondly, there's an opportunity cost to trapping resources in these unproductive firms. And in a sense, what we're thinking about here is the extent to which the trapping of these resources constrains growth opportunities for more productive firms. And finally, the increasing survival of these firms to the extent to which they congest markets and absorb valuable or scarce credit can actually crowd out entry and make growth opportunities more difficult for innovative young firms. Now, in terms of the empirical analysis in this study, we mainly focus on the second channel, and we have some evidence for the third channel. And in a sense, what we find is that across countries, when a greater share of the industry capital stock is sunk in zombie firms, you see that the typical healthy firm invests less, but they also hire fewer workers. This is also robust to sweeping out cyclical effects. So we try to look beyond the temporary effect of the crisis. And particularly what we see here is it's young and more productive firms who are penalised by the increasing survival of zombie firms. So to give you a sense of the economic magnitudes here, what we find, for instance, is that if Greece reduced, or if Italy reduced their zombie capital stock to the OECD minimum level, you would see a 2.5% gain on investment in cross-country one-point-in-time terms. This then translates into different effects on multi-factor productivity to the extent that it's more productive firms who are penalised by this effect. Now, thinking over time, we also have evidence to show that perhaps 1/4 of the decline in... So this is percentage changes of themselves. So for instance, non-zombie business investment in panel A, and panel B, for instance, is the contribution of capital reallocation to multi-factor productivity levels. So we then can ask the question, well, what's the consequence over time? And we estimate that perhaps 1/4 of the slowdown in business investment in Italy after 2007 can be attributed to the rise of zombie firms. So one key channel through which the survival of zombie firms can constrain the growth opportunities for healthier firms is through absorbing valuable credit in the economy. So what we do here is we take confidential data from the ECB on access to finance, which we then link to firms in our productivity data set. And what we see here is that in sectors that have a higher proportion of the capital stock sunk in zombie firms, healthy firms report greater difficulty in accessing finance. So this is some evidence for the idea that zombie firms impose a cost on the aggregate economy to the extent that basically they absorb valuable credit, which then can't be lent to more productive firms. So what should we do about this problem? So in a sense, the paper argues that there's 3 areas for policy reform. The first is on insolvency reform. So, insolvency regimes are crucial to the extent that they can bring debtors and creditors to the table and facilitate the orderly exit or restructuring of failing firms. This then can be expected to affect aggregate growth through the reallocation of resources from failing to more productive firms, and also the type of business strategy the firm will choose when they enter. If they know that failure is going to be heavily penalised, they may enter with more conservative business strategies than if it wasn't. So one of the things that make it difficult to assess the contribution of insolvency regimes to aggregate growth performance across countries is the shortcomings with the existing indicators. Now, we have a lot of evidence based on the World Bank doing business indicators that there are significant differences across countries in the cost or the number of days to close a business. And typically our research has shown that a longer cost to close a business is bad for productivity growth. Now, one of the problems we have is then trying to form specific policy recommendations off this research because we don't have any underlying policy levers. So this then motivated a cross-country policy questionnaire exercise where we tried to gather data on those key design features of insolvency regimes that we think are relevant for affecting the timely initiation of insolvency restructuring and liquidation procedures. So to give you a brief overview of the structure of the indicator, there's three main blocks and then a miscellaneous block. The first relates to personal insolvency regimes and essentially the treatment of failed entrepreneurs. So a key indicator here is the time to discharge. And this gives them the number of years it takes for a bankrupt person's pre-bankruptcy debts to be discharged. So it's in a sense, how long do they have to sit on the bench before their debts are forgiven and they can start a new business. We then have a second block which relates to sort of prevention streamlining indicators. And this sort of came out of the IMF Article 4 recommendations during the crisis, particularly for those heavily affected countries in Southern Europe. And this looks at the extent to which SMEs can avoid going through costly court procedures and try to resolve their situation out of court. And then most importantly, we have the corporate restructuring block. So in a sense here, this has about 5 main indicators. This looks at the extent to which there are rigidities in the initiation of corporate bankruptcy procedures across countries. You know, a key indicator here, or key subcomponent, is the ability of creditors to initiate a restructuring plan. So it's the case in only about 2/3 of countries that both firms and creditors can actually initiate restructuring. So you can imagine that if a creditor cannot initiate restructuring, then a zombie firm could linger in perilous state with these adverse consequences for aggregate productivity. So to give you a sense of what this indicator looks like, once we assemble these 3 main components, we see significant cross-country variation in this indicator. And I should say that the indicator is increasing in the extent to which the insolvency regime creates barriers to exit or restructuring. So for instance, in a country like Estonia, barriers to the insolvency regime are actually quite high. For instance, it takes 5 years for a bankrupt to be discharged of their pre-bankruptcy debts, so they can't start a business for a long time. In the US, it's only 5 months. So then what we do is we take these new indicators and we examine their relevance for aggregate productivity performance, and particularly some of the key sources of productivity weakness that Giuseppe mentioned in his introduction. So importantly, what we see is that insolvency reform can be important because they can reduce the share of industry capital sunk in zombie firms. And this is realised through 2 channels. Firstly, the exit of these weak firms, but more importantly, well-designed insolvency regimes can actually encourage the rehabilitation of these weak firms and improve their productivity, which is important for political economy reasons because the social costs will be lower than otherwise. This in turn spurs a reallocation to more productive firms. And then finally, we have evidence that well-designed insolvency regimes can actually facilitate technological diffusion within firms. So we know that when a firm adopts a new technology, they can't do this in isolation. They need to restructure their organisation. So a key channel through which insolvency reform can raise aggregate growth is helping those laggard firms restructure and improve their productivity via technology adoption. Just to give you a quick idea of the magnitudes, so for instance, we estimate that if Italy reduced their barriers to corporate restructuring to the sample minimum, which is the UK, you would see potentially a 9 percentage point reduction in the zombie capital share. This is significant because we know that in 2013, the aggregate zombie capital share in Italy was around 17 or 19% in a sense. The diamond then shows the extent to which reforms since 2010 have gone towards actually reducing this problem. So in a sense, in Greece, there's potentially a 9 percentage point gain from reducing insolvency rigidity to best practice, and recent reforms have potentially achieved about 5 percentage points of that gain. We then show that this insolvency reform flows through a more productive allocation of capital. That is, when you reform insolvency regimes, it becomes more likely that capital flows from weak firms to more productive firms, raising aggregate multi-factor productivity performance. And finally, there's also the effect on productivity performance within firms through more efficient technology adoption. So the second thing is we think that financial reform is necessarily to address this problem. So one of the key issues in Europe at the moment, particularly Southern Europe, is the extent to which weak banks are keeping zombie firms alive. So what we do here is we essentially link banks to firms. And what we show here essentially is that zombie firms are more likely to be connected to weak banks. So this is a classic story about bank forbearance, where banks basically run into problems on their balance sheet. And instead of actually reporting these loans as non-performing, they continue to extend credit to the firm so they don't have to confront these issues. So another thing we find is that, importantly, while it's the case that a more effective and speedy resolution of non-performing loans can address the zombie firm problem in Europe, it turns out that the success of this process is conditioned by the design of the insolvency regime. So when an insolvency regime is such that there's strong barriers to corporate restructuring, then it becomes less likely that a bank is going to get their money back if they report these loans as non-performing. So in a sense, you can think of this being that a weak insolvency regime raises the incentive for firms to bet on the resurrection of weak firms. So in a sense, what we do here on this chart is we estimate the extent to which a 2 standard deviation improvement in bank health translates into a reduction in the share of zombie firms. So for instance, we show that in Estonia, if they had the best practice insolvency regime equivalent to the UK, then this improvement in bank health could actually reduce the zombie firm share by almost 3 percentage points more. So in a sense, there's an important complementarity between not only measures to strengthen the banking sector and NPL resolution in particular, but also insolvency reform. And I guess one of the key issues here is that the weakness in the banking sector in Europe has brought into closer focus the over-reliance of the European economy on bank finance. And in a sense, we have a lot of evidence that suggests that more developed equity financing markets are important for productivity. And one of the important policy elements here is the extent to which the corporate tax system subsidised debt financing over equity financing. So the chart on the left here, for instance, just shows a pure difference in the effective tax rate for equity financing versus debt financing. I should make the point that these estimates, for instance, for the US, may change with the recent corporate tax reform. But the point is that debt financing is heavily subsidised in a number of OECD countries. We then show that the productivity gains from actually reducing this inherent debt bias in the tax system. And this is important because we know that intangible investments are not really the domain of bank financing. You know, intangibles are difficult to collateralise, so as such, it's important to have well-developed equity financing markets to essentially finance these productivity-enhancing investments. So the final thing is that to the extent that insolvency reform and financial reform improves productivity growth through more efficient corporate restructuring, you know, this is going to entail some social costs. In a sense, there's going to be a lot more churn in firms, but also workers are going to more likely lose their jobs. So in a sense, we argue that these corporate restructuring policies need to be accompanied by well-designed labour market activation policies. So in a sense, what we show here is that workers that are displaced by firm exit are much more likely to return to work in countries where there's more emphasis on active labour market policies, for instance, retraining and well-designed job placement schemes, than on passive measures such as long-lasting unemployment benefits. There's also a number of other policies here that are important for promoting residential mobility that can increase the likelihood that workers who lose their job through this restructuring process are returned to work. And finally, we show that the effectiveness of $1 spent on these active labour market policies is conditioned by 2 things. Firstly, the quality of the public institutions, but more importantly, the extent to which product market regulations encourage or inhibit the entry of new firms. Now, we know that, for instance, that new firms tend to disproportionately contribute to aggregate employment growth. And what we show here, for instance, is the impact of a 0.25 percentage point increase of GDP on ALMP spending on the probability that a worker displaced by firm exit is returned to work. And we see that with countries of low entry barriers in their product markets, the dividend here is almost twice as large as in other countries where these entry barriers are much higher. So finally, just to sum up, we believe that productivity growth, particularly in Europe, can be revived by policies that improve the efficiency of corporate restructuring, you know, particularly insolvency reform, but also efforts to improve bank health and encourage sources of equity financing. You know, it's important we also leverage the complementarities here between insolvency reform and NPL resolution, but but also through various active labour market policies and administrative entry barriers. So I'll leave it there for the moment, and thank you very much.
Our high-tech attempts to be pro-productivity are not going so well. Thank you very much, both Dan and Giuseppe. The substance here is terrific. It's the kind of thing that, you know, it seems like exactly the right framework for how you want to tackle this problem, and it's really interesting. And again, the paper with references to their other work is available on the Institute event website, as well as obviously the OECD website. You're kindly taking questions on the record, so before I turn to our distinguished audience, let me just pose a couple questions for you. The first is that at one point you mentioned the idea of productivity growth within firms, but most of the story seems to be a exit-entry story. It's about what the composition of firms in any given industry are. There is, however, another literature with which you're well familiar that suggests a huge amount of productivity growth we see is due to within-firm improvements in productivity. So how should, I know, I don't know. Like I said, productivity problems. Jess, can I have the microphone, please? Thank you. So without trying to drag this out, just can you give us a sense a bit more about how this set of results speaks versus the literature that is out there about within-firm productivity growth? And also just some of the interactions, because some of the countries that are in your ranking about low insolvency or not doing well with shutting down firms are ones that were held up previously as very good at doing within-firm improvements. So in a sense, there was an exit voice or loyalty argument. There used to be the idea that in Japan or Germany you had, I don't want to say captured capital, but you had the so-called long-term investors, and the lenders had to work with firms in bankruptcy. They didn't shut them down quickly. And this used to be seen as a virtue because it promoted within-firm growth. Now, maybe you just say, well, that's obviously wrong based on our results. But could you say a little more about the within-firm growth versus the exit-entry aspect of productivity?
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. It's a great question. So look, it's true that a lot of our policy analysis focuses on how insolvency reform can affect the reallocation of resources from less productive to more productive firms, and also the extent to which failing firms exit or restructured. So it is true that we have focused a lot of our attention on that. I should say, however, that we do have evidence that a well-designed insolvency regime can affect productivity within firms, and this is through the idea of technology adoption. So we find that in countries that have better designed insolvency regimes, it's more likely that these laggard firms can catch up to the productivity frontier. Now, the second dimension of this is that we think that there is an interaction between policies that affect the between element, so the reallocation element and the within element. And the way we think about this is through risk-taking. So you can think about this in that in a world where basically productive firms can rapidly upscale and low productivity firms can exit and release resources to underpin the growth of productive firms, it's probably more likely that an entrant is going to choose a radical innovation strategy because they know in the event of success they can rapidly upscale before their idea is taken, and then in the event of failure that the cost of downscaling are a lot lower. So we think there's also that interaction as well. Now, for instance, when you're thinking about these more cumulative innovation countries like Germany or Italy, I guess one of the questions is well, that set of institutions have served them well for the last 20 or 30 years. But what happens when they need to move into new activities? Is that set of institutions that focuses a lot on worker loyalty and those type of different things you mentioned? Will that be actually the right set of institutions for 10 or 20 years' time? We don't know that. But there is evidence that policies that slow down reallocation tend to make the transition to these different economic activities more difficult and costly.
Thank you. Giuseppe, if you want to come in, you should. So let me just pick up on one other thing from Giuseppe's introductory remarks and slides. You had the two-panel slide, manufacturing and services, where the frontier was the black line going up or going flat, and the gray line was the laggards. And you were saying how this was, you all were understandably emphasizing the laggard story. But one of the stylized facts you mentioned, both of you mentioned going up front, is the idea that there seems to be a lot of accumulation in the leaders. And our colleagues, Jason Furman and Peter Orzag, and Jason, as you know, did a lot of work with his CEA team when he was at the CEA on this, exploring the idea that in a lot of networked industries and industries we don't necessarily even think of as networked, there are a lot of both rents and true economic rewards that you get by being the front. So again, I'm not trying to rant here. I'm trying to help you help our audience put these things in context. So how should we think about your results, which you portray as a laggard story rather than a leader story, since there are a bunch of other people who say it may be leaders and oligopoly power and things like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Clearly, when you look at these figures, one issue that arises is to what extent you are capturing real differences in what we would call quantity-based multi-factor productivity. So, because clearly at a firm level we cannot measure that very well. So it could be that some of the the takeoff of the leaders is reflecting in fact rising markups and rising prices and so. So what we do there is, well, first of all, we look at this is an aggregate of the same figure across industries. And if you look at the industry level, you can see that in sectors that are highly digitalized, this gap is even larger. Second, you can also adjust for markups, using standard methodologies, which of course have their limitations, but it's better than nothing. And if you do that, you see that in manufacturing, it doesn't make much of a difference. And in services, you can account around 1/3 of the rising gap by looking at rents, but the rest remains. So to the best of our knowledge, it really reflects a real gap in productive efficiency between the average firm and the leaders. And the fact that it's higher in services than in manufacturing is also interesting, because we know that services are the part of the economy that it's closer, that is closer to trade, that is more regulated and so on. So it has some interesting implications for policy as well. I don't know if that's answering your question. Maybe Dan, I don't know.
Just a final question before I open it up. So I in my intro, I obviously referred to something that was not in the scope of your study, but that we also speak about zombie firms in China, and in particular about state-owned enterprises. And as Chinese and many other officials point out, actually a lot of countries have state-owned enterprises. So I don't want to project from which charts I read, because I haven't obviously assimilated the vast amount of research in this report, but it seemed like your base data set was focused on publicly traded companies and private sector. How much do you think that state-owned enterprises in various fields are contributing to a similar sort of zombie or laggard effect. And if you're not sure, is there any way you would try to use this apparatus to get at that question?
Okay. I mean, it's an excellent question. I think you're also referring to the IMF work on the zombie issue there, which is a really important thing. So the short answer is yes, state-owned enterprises matter. We do our best to try to remove the obvious ones from the data set, but there are difficulties in measuring this. And I think I should say that we're only capturing part of the phenomenon in terms of the policy tools we look at. Another issue is the extent to which these crisis-induced support schemes, for instance, for SMEs in terms of public guarantees for loans, remained in place after the crisis. So in a lot of countries, these schemes are still there. And that's likely to also prop up these firms. So I think there's a number of different relevant policy tools here, including SMEs, and it's not just insolvency reform.
Can I add just one thing, one anecdote on this state-owned enterprises issue? When we first computed I don't know if this works. Does it work? When we first computed the share of zombies for Italy, the share was 25%. And we got into a fight with the Italian government because two large state-owned companies were part of the data set, and removing them from the data sets lowered the share to around 19%. So it didn't make it makes a difference, but not so much relative to the ranking of Italy relative to the other countries. But it's kind of indicative of how important this can be for the zombie issue.
Thank you both very much. Let me turn it over to our audience. Jessica has a roving mic. There's a mic in back. Jess, could you go over there first, please, and then to that gentleman. Please identify yourself when asking a question.
Olivier Blanchard, PI. A lot of numbers, but in the end, I didn't get the bottom line number, which is suppose you could do either everything you want or everything which is politically feasible. These might be two different things. By how much could we increase productivity growth in the E8, which seemed to be the place where there was more room to improve?
Let me pile on, Olivier, in this following sense. So as you started, and as both of you in your opening slides started, we've seen this very significant productivity slowdown. And some of the countries that you pointed to as doing well on various indicators were actually some of the biggest slowdowns, and vice versa. So like Great Britain, UK is listed as one of your exemplars in insolvency regimes, but it's seen probably the largest productivity slowdown on average of any of the G8. So again, as with Olivier, sort of what's the big picture? How does this compare to the magnitudes of the slowdown we're talking about, and how much could we get back?
Okay. That's the million-dollar question. So, we're certainly not saying that it's only insolvency regimes that matter for aggregate productivity and the slowdown. Look, in a country like Italy, we estimate that, for instance, 1/4 of the decline in business investment at the aggregate could be explained by the zombie phenomenon. And we think we can potentially explain half of the zombie phenomenon in Europe due to in Italy, due to insolvency regime weakness. There's also going to be interaction with NPLs there. So we think that it is significant. But your point about the UK is really interesting. So one of the interesting things about the UK is we know that they have a long left tail of low productivity firms, but they actually do okay on the zombie metric compared to other countries. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the UK, the actual share of the capital stock sunk in zombie firms actually declined. And it's no coincidence that they probably have one of the best insolvency regimes in the OECD. So I guess in a counterfactual sense, things would have been a lot worse if they actually didn't have a good set of exit policies.
No, that's great, and that's fascinating. I hope there's a box about that somewhere in your report, but just going back to Olivier's question. So Italy, in a sense, notwithstanding the Italian government's desire to keep it from being so, is in a sense the problem child. So you're saying about 1/8 of the shortfall in investment could be attributed to zombie firms? And order of magnitude, how much is the investment story, the productivity, how much of the productivity story?
So in the post-crisis period, most of the decline in labour productivity is explained by weak business investment. And so in terms of, that's only one part of the effect, but that's the effect of zombie congestion on the average non-zombie firm. There's also the additional effects through entry, through the deterrent of entry of innovative firms, and also the reallocation of productive resources from less productive to more productive firms. So in a sense, the numbers we're reporting in this report we think are a lower bound. The other thing is we're only looking at the effect of zombie firms or insolvency reform on reallocation within narrowly defined industries. There's also reasons to expect that basically insolvency reform can affect the extent to which productive resources are reallocated from one industry to another industry. So in a sense, we think that these numbers are very conservative in terms of estimating the scale of the problem.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No, just one small thing. I think that if you look at Italy in particular, most of the decline in productivity is due to within firm productivity. So they had negative within firm productivity growth. The reallocation element is actually contributing positively to it, and so it's an investment story. And the second thing is I agree very much with Olivier's suggestion that you probably would like to the zombie story is part of a larger story, which is about surviving weakly productive firms. So it's a kind of the story about the left tail of the distribution. Why is it getting fatter? Not all of these firms are zombie firms. But why is this happening? This is an area of research that has not been so much studied yet.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, Luigi Irani from Banca Intesa San Paolo. In 2014, when I was working at the IMF, I contributed to a part of the Chapter 1 of the Global Financial Stability report, where we found very similar, obviously analysis was less profound than yours, but we found very similar results, that there was a clear relationship between how well the tribunals function, how easy it is and how fast it is to resolve crisis in the corporate sector, and it's linked to NPL. So the slower tribunals, they hire the NPLs in banks. So that's obviously, I think it's a fairly standard result. However, especially in the case of Italy, there seems to be at play, at least until 2015 or 2016, another factor which doesn't seem to me it has received a lot of attention in your paper, which is the fiscal treatment of losses on credit. Actually, now I work for a private bank, and so I'm looking at this from a different angle. But until, I think, 2016, Italian banks could not deduce from their P&L for tax purposes their losses on credit. They could, but on a very long time horizon. I think it was 10 years. So it's not that Italian banks really wanted to provide oxygen to zombies firms just for the sake of it, but it was actually very costly for them to write off credit losses. So I think, in this analysis, you should also, consider this tax issue, and you should also control for what is the fiscal treatment of losses for banks in their balance sheet when it comes to, writing off credits to bankruptcy, to bankrupt corporates. Thanks.
I think it's a good point. Look, there's a number of policy design issues that are going to interact with this problem. When we looked at the effect of banking sector weakness on the survival of zombie firms, we were trying to sort of look generally across countries to make the connection between weak banks and zombie firms. And then we tried to explore the extent to which there was some heterogeneity through mainly the channel of the insolvency regime. But I think what you're saying is there's going to be these other fiscal levers that are also going to sort of alter this relationship across countries. And I think that would be a really interesting thing for future research. But certainly there are Italy-specific papers that show that there is evidence of bank forbearance and weak banks extending credit to zombie firms. The big debate is, of course, what's the aggregate consequence of this?
Nick Lardy, Peterson. I'm wondering if you can give us a little more granular data on how these losses are being financed. You mentioned guaranteed loans to SMEs in some countries might still be a significant factor, but with 3 years of interest cost above operating earnings, are these companies financing it from previously retained earnings or rolling over of loans? What can you say about how these firms are getting financed?
That's a very good question. So, I think there's a number of important issues in here when you do this analysis. One is, for instance, the extent to which a firm is part of a multinational group. You can imagine if it was a subsidiary of a multinational group, these zombie firm indicators could merely be a function of the design of the balance sheet. So one of the things that we're careful to do is try to remove those instances where we might think that basically balance sheet cosmetics could be an issue. But more substantively, the debate on bank forbearance in Europe at the moment is actually more about forbearance on the stock of loans as opposed to forbearance on the new lending. So this is essentially, because of the new regulatory environment, it's become harder for banks to extend new credit to failing firms. But what they might do, for instance, is basically create more favourable terms on the existing stock. So, for instance, they might give a firm a repayment holiday on their existing debts. They might, for instance, forgive certain debt payments. So there's sort of these very opaque things that banks are potentially doing that can contribute to the survival of zombie firms. And in one of the underlying research papers, we try to sort of identify a holistic link between bank health and zombie firms, so we can do our best to capture these other channels through which forbearance can occur. So there's there's not a lot of transparency here. So so I'll leave it there. Do you want to?
No, one limitation. I mean, this is, of course, it would be. This is an area where it would be very interesting to dig much deeper in bilateral relationship between banks and firms. But one big limitation is that the data is not so easily available. Like, for instance, the work that Dan has done with Philippos Petrouglakis was relying on confidential ECB data. But if one looks at publicly available data, the proxies that you have to use to identify the main bank correspondent to each firm are quite crude. That's really a big limitation, and it suggests that, especially at the cross-country level, and the cross-country level is the one in which you can look at the effects of policies, because you have the variability across countries. Otherwise, you have to rely on changes in policies within each country, and then then you can maybe use national data that is more readily available. But I mean, at the cross-country level, we have this big limitation in the availability of confidential data.
Thank you. At the back, Mike.
Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute. Very interesting work, and it's hard to digest all of it in for 35 minutes. And you may have touched on this, and it may actually not be relevant from some of the questions. But my question would be, to what extent is the phenomenon that you have identified been responsible for the observed slowdown in productivity growth? My sense is that you may not be able to do that, except to the extent that you think that these barriers have led to an increase in misallocation of capital going forward. But I'm not, and it may be because of the relatively narrow scope of your work, which is nevertheless important, that you can't say. I am interested that this is a topic on which, if I put it that way, representatives of advanced countries have been dictating to advising, if I may put it that way, less advanced countries for years, and it turns out that we should have spent some time looking ourselves in the mirror. But That's a comment rather than a question. The last part is a comment rather than a question.
I like that comment, though, so it's okay.
It's a very good question. I think it's connected to Olivier's question at the start. Look, one of the limitations for us when we're trying to link the contribution of insolvency regimes to the slowdown is we don't have data before 2010. So a lot of our analysis is cross-sectional, and it makes the point that reforming insolvency regimes now can actually boost productivity growth. It's harder to actually say the extent to which insolvency regimes contributed to the productivity slowdown. However, we do know that before the crisis in a number of OECD countries, not only is this phenomenon of rising productivity dispersion occurring, but we do see that weak firms are increasingly surviving. So this isn't just a story to do with the crisis and a cyclical shock exacerbating productivity weakness. There's a lot of evidence. I mean, Giuseppe Nicoletti was here, I think, a year and a half ago, documenting the rise in capital misallocation in Southern Europe. And this was a pre-crisis phenomenon. And, we can then connect a lot of our relevant policy tools to the allocation of capital across firms of different productivity. So in a sense, we use these micro dimensions of the productivity slowdown to then motivate our analysis today of the extent to which policies that affect the restructuring of weak firms can raise aggregate productivity growth.
I have to say, Dan, I'm both impressed and grateful that you kept in mind Sebnem's presentation here, which indeed was from this NBER work related to yours, and I'm hopeful that others will similarly be watching and referring to your and Giuseppe's presentation, so we keep the conversation going. Yeah, I see another question there, please, Jess.
Hi, just very briefly. Ben Dennis from the U.S. Treasury. Could you tell us, is there any sort of pattern or breakdown in terms of the sector or regional location of some of these firms? I'm just trying to get at whether or not there are other reasons why these firms may carry some sort of social value.
It's a good question. I think my recollection of the Japanese work Adam mentioned at the start was more of a phenomenon of the services sector. There was some construction being relevant. When we look across OECD countries, on average, you don't see big differences across sectors, but then there are some country-specific instances. For instance, construction in Spain is clearly a relevant case. I think the second part of your question is then sort of getting to the social costs of addressing the zombie firm issue. If you think that there's, for instance, a geographical concentration of these weak firms, and then you restructure them and there's job losses, that can have a lot of adverse political economy effects. So certainly we do find evidence that the type of policy reforms we're proposing do increase firm exit. But we also find that they can actually improve the likelihood that a weak firm is restructured back to good health. So in that sense, that's a good news story, that the firm isn't just exiting and some value is saved, the costs, the social dislocations are lower. We also then advocate that you can't do insolvency reform in isolation. You need to spend a lot more on basically returning workers to jobs, the type of workers who are affected by these. And it's those retraining schemes and particularly the job placement schemes that are particularly important.
Sorry, this gentleman here, please.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure how easy it is to decide. Stephen Braun, Council of Economic Advisors. How easy is it to label something a zombie firm? I mean, for example, let's suppose you have two Italian firms, one of which is profitable, one isn't. They're in the same industry. One of them employs all Italian labor. The other one outsources everything they can to cheap labor in India or China or some other undeveloped country. So one's very profitable and one isn't. The only difference between them is one is outsourcing a lot. Would you want would your productivity improvement would your labeling one firm very productive imply that all firms should start outsourcing more?
It's a great question on methodology. You know, one of the things we're careful to do is to remove those instances where that phenomenon of outsourcing is likely to be more likely. So typically you would imagine that a firm that's part of a multinational group is more likely to do that. One of the things we can do is identify subsidiaries of multinationals in our data. When we remove those instances, our results remain. So we've been very careful to sort of make sure that this is a real phenomenon and not just something to do with the shifting of resources across borders, for instance. I mean, it's a very good point, but I'd say that we do our best to try sort of rule out the possibility that the results are being driven by that type of cosmetic effect, if you like.
So let me just pick up on your response to Steve, and then, well, last thing relating to Steve and Ben on social values. I mean, this is great how comprehensive and how thoughtfully you all and your colleagues have done this. But apropos of the outsourcing discussion, in a sense, what you're saying, if I understood you correctly with your methodology, or rather the robustness of the results to that methodology, is that effectively the multinational corporation subsidiaries are rarely in the left tail. That you can take out the multinationals and the results don't change very much is another way of saying that the multinational subsidiaries are not usually the zombies. And there are a variety of reasons that might be the case, some of which have to do with profit shifting, some of which have to do with access to credit, some of which have to do with diversification, or as our colleague Carolyn Freund and others have argued, some of which may have to do with if you're out there in global competition, you tend to be a star, you tend to be more productive to begin with. Anyway, so is this an argument, as was often made in the case of Japan and was made in the case of Mexico, for example, that maybe you don't want outsourcing per se, but a real issue isn't just getting rid of zombie firms, it's you want consolidation. You don't want to have a large retail or construction sector filled with lots of little firms. I mean, is that, I'm stretching a lot, but is that a conjecture that could come out of your data? Is that something you'd want to see? Because if we turn to like our friends at McKinsey Global Institute, for reasons of varying quality, often their results point in that direction. It's that, you know, Mexico's got a problem because it's got all these small domestically oriented firms. Multinationals are good. So is that, in a sense, one message to take from your study?
I mean, Carolyn, maybe I'll just jump in first. Carolyn's work, I think this is on the contribution of large superstar firms to the global economy, is terrific. Look, I would say that we're very much of the view that productivity and the size of a firm should be correlated. So what we want to see is an economy where resources get reallocated to the most productive firms. So it's not just size per se, it's also that those firms are productive.
Yeah, I mean, having said this, there is a phenomenon to be explained, which is also found by researchers in the US, like Foster, Haltiwanger, and others, that the contribution of large firms to productivity growth has been declining. In the sense that the correlation between size and productivity has been going down. So there's something to be explained there, which which is puzzling. And so to answer your question, I think that there's a bit more than just either you outsource abroad or not. There's also domestic outsourcing, like that has to do with the boundaries of the firm, and to an extent, this changing of the boundaries has, in a way, contributed to changing the productivity landscape. But this is a structural development, which I'm not sure that policy would like to interfere with. Not that it would have to interfere with the global outsourcing either, but I think it's complicated. I don't think we could have a general statement. We that all firms should become multinationals. You know?
Just to be clear, I wasn't advocating that, but I was sort of trying to push that to draw out from you this aspect. So just a final question, again, picking up on the our last two guests' questions, our guests' last two questions. So you do have this part at the end about labor adjustment, and you have made clear acknowledgement of that. Have you done any work essentially cross-correlating this with some of the previous work OECD has done on labor market churn or other factors? In other words, is it, so there's sort of the functional results you sometimes get cross-nationally, like Danny Roderick's result, that countries that are more open to globalization tend to have larger welfare states. If I do a mental scatter plot of what's in your charts, and this may be inaccurate, but if I do a mental scatter plot, we get the opposite correlation here. The countries that have the regimes that promote the most closure of zombie firms are also the countries that have the least labor market support, right? So if USA and UK are the ones who are being most heartless to zombie companies, they also are, relatively speaking, most heartless to displaced workers. So have you looked at that at all, this interaction, or maybe not interaction, coincidence?
That's a very good question. Look, what we do know is two things. The first is that spending on active labour market policies is particularly effective at cushioning the adjustment costs from this. And we know that the Scandinavian countries do a lot of this. And so you see that the probability that a worker who is displaced due to firm exit returns to work in Sweden is 75%. That number is under 50% in Southern Europe, where they spend less on this. So that clearly matters. The second thing you're talking about, however, is an interaction with the insolvency regime. We haven't done that, but we've looked, for instance, about the interactions with entry barriers as opposed to exit barriers. And one of the stories there is that, so for instance, you're referring to the US or UK, they spend relatively little on active labour market policies. But we know that because their entry barriers are low, the bang for the buck of doing so is going to be very high in those countries. So in a sense, there's a lot of scope for those countries to actually get value for their money from improving spending on those types of policies.
Thank you all for coming out on a non-Davos, non-snowy day in Washington to get at the real issues of competitiveness and world economy. I'm very grateful to Giuseppe Nicoletti and Dan Andrews of the OECD Structure. I'm making sure I got the acronym right. Structural Policy Analysis Division for another outstanding set of research contribution to the public debate. And we're glad to have had you here at Peterson to bring it to this audience. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.